Thanks, Tom. It's really great to be here, and it's been a really inspiring 3 days for some of us and 2 days for some of us as well. The question of research in the geodesign enterprise is an important one. You can think of perhaps an R&D enterprise where we've seen lots of developments, and these must be driven by research, by questions, by ways of thinking about what we know and what we don't know. So my colleague Michael Flaxman and I thought to put together a first pass at this. Button. Why would we do this? Because we need to know. What do we know? We need to know what's unknown in our enterprise and where the unknowingness or the missingness of that information, to use a word that I learned, would be an hindrance that we'd like to overcome to make better and better our approaches to and the results of geodesign.
And so I'm the practitioner here, so at a hard-nosed level, why worry about research agendas if you're in practice? Well, we wouldn't be standing here if it wasn't for some of the research that Carl and others initiated quite a few years back. And I think, to me, there's a real need in extending the community, particularly in dealing with science and in large decision-making, that we need to really provide evidence of success of geodesign methods. And some people will like it because it's a sexy-sounding idea. Other people are going to be tougher to convert. So basically, we need to develop from a pragmatic point of view, we need to develop evidence for the success of these methods where they work. And in a reflective fashion, we need evidence of problems where things don't work so that we can fix those.
And I've asked Mike to start us off with giving us some examples of the evidence-seeking enterprise, and then we will indeed interleave.
So my first research question came about 1998 when I showed up at Harvard GSD and started a puzzle about the issue of why don't designers use GIS? And the most obvious, easy answer was that they'd be ignorant about it. But at Harvard GSD, that was absolutely not the case. So I had to kind of take seriously what it was that designers were doing, and that made me think about the second question, which is really what could GIS learn from designers? And I've been spending the better part of 15 years trying to answer those preliminary questions. So I wanted to show you 3 examples from my current practice, basically each with different concerns and very different starting points. So I'm working on 3 fairly large projects. So these exemplify geodesign applied to regional studies. One is the Florida Beaches Habitat Conservation Plan. Sorry for the slang. So habitat conservation plans are driven by the Endangered Species Act. The second one is a National Science Foundation study called ecohydrology, and it deals with ecosystem services and comes really from a science point of view. And the third is something for the Bureau of Land Management in the Great Basin. And that's coming from the point of view of a natural resource management agency that has a whole set of methods, but they need to deal with new issues. In their case, both climate change and how to deal with policy alternatives. So the context of the first one, my customers are over on the right, so some sea turtles, some shorebirds, and a beach mouse. I only put one beach mouse because I can't tell them apart, even though I've been working on the project for a few years. So these folks started with a traditional impact assessment framework, but they needed to be able to do minimization and mitigation accounting. So it's a part of the Endangered Species Act that's less famous, but under Section 10 of the Endangered Species Act, instead of them just saying where not to do anything, you can actually set up a mitigation scheme. But this thing had been scoped enormously. So it deals with 16 different endangered species, 400 miles of beach, 50 different types of permits at a rate of about 10,000 permits a year, and so far has involved 6 years of meetings. So not out of the woods yet on the last topic. So the project was underway for 2 years before I was even hired, and kind of makes you ask why. And it turns out they had ignored the impact of sea level rise in their first couple of years ago around, and that was not a very good idea for a project in Florida on beaches. So they kind of got to a veto stage where Fish and Wildlife Service said, no, we don't think you're really taking this too seriously if you're not going to consider sea level rise. But they didn't have a technical framework capable of simulating biological impacts at scale. Lots of species, lots of sites. And they didn't have a conceptual framework to be able to target the minimization and mitigation or to account for it quantitatively. And so when you're working at scales like this, that's a huge problem. Shown on the bottom and to the right is kind of one example of some of the methods we've been deploying. I'm not going to talk about those in details, but using LiDAR data, we've been able to do viewshed analyses for sea turtle lighting so that we can keep sea turtles happy on the beaches. And in terms of what we did and how we approached this one, basically we had three major steps. The first was to create contextual scenarios that looked specifically at sea level rise and beach development. So those go by different names, but that's basically what the world does to you. So those are scenarios that Beach's HCP program can't do much about. They form the context of the decision. And then we created an interactive online impact assessment tool that at this point is supporting about 100 participants, and that's shown at the top. Because we needed to be able to do GIS-style impact assessment, but we actually needed to be able to collect the parameters for that, the settings, from hundreds of scientists. And they didn't agree, as Carl would say. So the top shows just basically drilling down and looking at a particular segment of beach and figuring out what is causing impact on that beach, whether it's from seawalls or single-family housing or whatnot. So that was a kind of massive version of impact assessment in terms of participation, but expert participation. And then the third part that we're still in the midst of is developing a mitigation planning scenarios. So given what the world's doing to you, what are you going to do back? And at this scale, it's, you can call it design, you can call it planning, but somebody needs to figure out what mitigation is going to be done and where it's going to be done. And so we're in the midst of that. A second kind of large design process, and I'll speed it up a little bit, I think, for time, but we're responsible for the scenario planning piece of this very large NSF project, and it's focused on developing new methods for water management in South Florida, and particularly looking at green infrastructure and managing water. And the client here is the Southern Florida Water Management District, who really do manage the water. So it's a pretty serious study, 5 years, $5 million roughly. And what we did on this one was to create an online scenario planning platform that had to deal with hydrology. And so in this diagram here, the red indicates performance, below or above target, and the width of the line represents basically flow. And so this is an interactive system where we can go month by month into the future and look at where we're getting the water right, where we're meeting targets, where we're missing targets. And what's driving all of this are ecosystem services that are trying to make sure that we account for having too much water, i.e. flooding, or blowing out estuaries, or too little water, i.e. Not meeting urban water supply targets. And then a third final example, basically just starting, so the BLM is sponsoring this effort in the Great Basin, and they start from the position of needing to figure out where to put millions of acres of commitment for sage-grouse habitat restoration. But in a landscape where, if you know anything about that part of the world, it's not called the sage-grass rebellion for nothing. It's a challenging political circumstance, let's say. And their prior method was to have one scenario. So basically, this is taking an agency that's got a process and trying to get them to consider the role of human agency and design in how this place might change. And in summary, from kind of these three projects or my current practice, Stephen asked me to kind of develop my starting questions for research. And the three that came up to the top of my list after all these years of muddling in this were, first of all, how do you make geodesign use routine? So I showed you three examples of kind of bringing geodesign to practice. It's not that there aren't existing methods and setups. It's you got to sneak in originally the geodesign part, show people that it's useful, and that's how it'll propagate. The second one is, I think, really important from the science and research community point of view. We have to be able to figure out how to engage with ecosystem services and accounting for those in a quantitative way. And that includes, by the way, positive impacts like mitigating in the Beach's HCP case, as well as negative ones. And then the third one, I think, is maybe the most important. It's basically this notion of robust decision making, that we need to be able, it's inherently complicated, but it's a complicated world. We need to be able to evaluate plans against multiple contextual scenarios, multiple sea level rise scenarios, multiple economic scenarios, and that has to be made routine and as simple as possible. So that's kind of those are the three questions that I started off this consideration thinking about, and I'm going to hand back to Stephen for how we are.
So we thought about if Mike is busy and he comes up with another couple of dozen and there's 30 more people out there, soon we have hundreds of these questions. And how might we go about organizing them and thinking about them and aggregating them and understanding where their overlaps are and where their urgencies and priorities are? Well, there are many different ways of organizing knowledge other than lists. And one is, of course, an encyclopedic kind of approach. One could go to some source like the UCGIS body of knowledge that was mentioned earlier and you saw an example of outside, and see if the keywords that you've got are there in that list. But that's over 100 terms, and you almost need a computer to do that. And it might work, but it didn't seem to be a sufficiently concise way of thinking about a trajectory of organization for this kind of thing. So we looked back a little bit in the history of this enterprise that we are in. You could argue easily that geodesign has evolved out of the GIS movement in many ways. And we looked at the founding documents for the National Center for Geospatial Information Analysis, the NCGIA. Very simple triangle with 3 poles. Triangles are good, they're simple. 3 is a good number. It's a stable form. The human, society, and the computer. Well, that's proves to be an interesting rubric for putting topics in there, but we didn't find space, and we didn't find design, and we didn't think that it yet has all the pieces that we need. So we said, well, what are some other possibilities? One could look at Ervin's famous 15-part framework for a geodesign system. What would be the things that you would need, the kinds of tools you would want in your toolbox, and how do those research questions map into there? It's attractive because 15 is less than 100, although it's still a big number. It has specific reference to design activities, the ideas of configurations and constraints and abstraction and diagrams, the very design-specific components of geodesign, so that part of it is attractive. But still, again, perhaps too many categories and too kind of custom in this configuration.
So we also looked at a list that Bill Miller put together back in 2012 of Geodesign Technologies. And this was in the context of a white paper he wrote on the topic. And in a way, this is quite similar to Stephen's original incarnation. It's very operational. And so these are all things that are kind of unarguably pieces of what we need to move this forward. But we thought it was a bit overly instrumental for a research framework because this is kind of the outputs, not the inputs, basically. And then, of course, we went straight over to Carl's 6-step framework, and that was really initially very tempting. In fact, I tried an early version of this talk fitting things into that. And I use this, I have to say, in my professional practice for every project. Because it is a very good operational framework. So the advantage is obviously it's well known and it's procedurally strong, but it really came up with a major challenge, which is it's always tacit on the who and on issues of scale in particular. So we actually, as a thought experiment, started working on Carl's later framework, the 4-pole Venn diagram, famous from the cover of his book. And this kind of struck us as perhaps being the sweet spot because it's useful, broad, and clearly spatial. Unlike the NCGIA framework, it actually introduces design explicitly. And as a roadmap kind of diagram, I found it very useful that it connects to disciplines. So you kind of know who you might need help from on various parts of this and where you might go to look for them. There was one oddity that we came up with right away, which is where do all the rest of the sciences show up? And that was our first conversation. But that also we kind of felt works well in the sense that the sciences, when you're dealing with them in geodesign context, actually have to flow through the geographic sciences. So yes, we deal with hydrology, but unless we have it mapped or it spatialized in some way or another, it's quite difficult to deal with in geodesign. So basically, we thought that passed the initial smell test, and we also noted that a lot of the educators out ahead on this stuff, and Tom Paradise from NAU basically used this very same diagram to structure the curriculum there. So that struck us as good positive evidence that this might be a useful thing to hang your hat on. And we decided to dig in a little bit.
So I thought that we needed, Carl's diagram neatly clarifies where geodesign is, right at the intersection space here. Unlike, by the way, Noel Cressy's Venn diagram, which had geodesign sort of as a quarter of a fragment of a pie shape there. So we like that. And I think we got to make a little more room in the middle because geodesign is actually a pretty big tent. So I wanted to redraw this diagram a little bit with its opposing poles and make some space. And what I found particularly useful in the thinking about this, looking at this, is that one of the powers comes exactly from the intersection spaces. That is, this place between the design professionals and the people of the place gives rise to this need for collaboration. And the space between people of the place and the geographic science has been called critical GIS and social GIS. And that there's an emergent sense of the idea that geographic science information technologies have given rise to the GIST exercise, obviously, and the technologies that we take for granted, and that in between design and information has clearly been the whole explosion of computer-aided design and even artificial intelligence. And these things are operational, but they are also, in many ways, each of them a kind of a discipline as well. So now we have an 8-pole star, much like the navigator's compass, and I think that's a useful and powerful framework to work with. So I reached into my email list and I sent out a short query to a dozen colleagues who I thought might have something to say about this, and I asked them a simple question. I said, give me a geodesign research question, something that you think is important that might fit in there. And so I got back a dozen different, and I've taken the liberty of sometimes paraphrasing or chopping them down, but I'll tell you some of the things that they said. What are some examples of projects, real or imagined, that clearly and convincingly serve to define what geodesign is, and importantly, what it isn't? Well, so this made me realize that we really need one more kind of pole to this, and these are almost the kind of existential reflective questions about this exercise that we call geodesign. Carl wrote, what are the relationships between problem, size, type, and scale, and effective ways of designing? How complex do models need to be in order to properly influence geodesign decisions? And I thought that that seemed to make sense as sitting over here on the design with people and with technology side of this little emerging map. Our colleagues from ESRI, Eric Whitner and Bill Milner, wrote in different ways, how can and should 2D planning tools and 3D simulation tools interact? What are some desirable attributes of geodesign dashboards? What tools and techniques are required for productive, multi-party, web-enabled collaboration in geodesign? Very clearly here in the technology zone. Mike Flaxman, when I finally got him to answer, and you saw the 3 that he sent there, said effectively, which social and technical methods need to be developed to support routine geodesign use and updating of best available science? How do we put these parts together with people and technology? Matt Wilson, a geographer from Kentucky, wrote simply, what does the doing of critical geodesign mean? A topic on which he's written and is appearing in the forthcoming special issue. Very clearly here in this area of the people and the geographic sciences. To what extent should or would geodesign approaches and practices benefit from, as well as shape, innovative, smart environments in order to improve or facilitate citizen engagement? Stéphane Roche, our colleague from Canada, not here this year, I don't think, clearly up here in the people of the place side of the equation. How is geodesign different from traditional design? Does the notion of a primary generator have relevance to the meaning in the context of geodesign? And what might be the best uses of AI in geodesign? Alan Shearer from University of Texas, and scattered all over the map there. Tim Nyerges wrote, what system architectures can form the basis of an end-to-end, top-to-bottom geodesign environment to address complex, sustainable systems, decision interventions that are theoretically sound and practically useful? Sitting right down here. Mike Goodchild wrote, how can GIS technology be extended to include and cover all of the elements of a geodesign ontology? Remember that word? Including, for example, dynamics, interactions, affordances, and especially purpose, answers to the why questions. Some of us remember when Mike distinguished between design with a big D and design with a little d, and this, I think, puts him very clearly over here in these questions of design as a part of geodesign. Tom Fisher wrote, what role might geodesign play in addressing the grand challenges of our time? We've heard about that in the last 2 days. And how might these tools and methods be more widely used in order to deal with those challenges? Kellyanne Foster reiterated Dana's question. What distinguishes geodesign from other processes? Clearly, another existential question. And Ervin wrote, not for the first time, what are the roles of design diagrams in geodesign and how might they be computed with? Sitting over here in the design side of things. So that dozen or so questions leads to a fairly interesting pattern. There are ideas all over the map out of this. I didn't prep any of these initial questions. These were quite open in the invitation. And this list of 12 still has this problem of being a list, but it starts, I think, through the structure of this universe that we've laid out to be able to fall into some areas where we can note there's an awful lot of work over here on the design side, no surprise. And there seems to be some openness in there. I was quite struck on Wednesday afternoon when Carl, at the end of his then presentation, clarified this question. What kinds of digital information management support are needed for geodesign workflow, and especially for the change, design, models in geodesign collaboration? And that, I think, is as crisp an example of a question that's very clearly, uniquely, effectively, and only about geodesign that can help us drive this exercise. And like all good research questions, it both refers to larger questions and also smaller questions. What are workflows? Are there others that we're more alike or less alike? What is collaboration? How is it defined? Is geodesign collaboration different from other kinds of collaboration? So these questions can begin to spawn a whole family of other kinds of questions. I think one of the things that we've learned from this brief exercise looking into it is one key thing is that the design part of geodesign is pretty important. It's one of the things that distinguishes what we're doing from what otherwise usually happens here at ESRI and other GIS kinds of colloquies and conferences. It's the design component, the marriage of geographic information and science with design that gives to it. As we all benefit from other ongoing research in GIS, of course, there are these very special questions about design, but design research is hard. And that's one of the huge challenges ahead of us. That's for you.
So the other observation we made looking over the set was that basically both design and science are taking place in the context of what I talked about earlier, this kind of exogenous or contextually changing world. And so we have a kind of opportunity there to work with colleagues across disciplines, and the concept of spatial scenarios keeps coming up and up and up because it's basically a good representation for these different parties to collaborate on. And that's always been a really important part of GIS, and it shouldn't be surprising it continues to be in geodesign. But and I would say the same about this one, impact assessment, again, has always been a part of GIS. But we've seen a number of examples on the conference already of great examples, really, of much more interactive impact assessment than was ever done previously. And impact assessment done live on the fly in front of an audience and so forth. So we need an empirical research base to basically demonstrate the value of these things. We think strongly, I think, that they're likely to be useful, but nonetheless we need to prove that. And Carl's work and his experiments actually suggest a really troubling or difficult, maybe not troubling, but a difficult subtext to this, which is that it appears that impact assessment methods, just like change methods, may vary quite a bit by scale. And so that makes it much harder, of course, to match the right methods to the right design types.
One more for you.
And fourth observation basically was to tie back to actually Janine Benio's keynote from a little bit back, where she challenged us to start design with a very high standard, which is basically nature. And ecosystem services do, again, provide a framework for quantifying triple bottom line types of impacts. And we've seen a number of examples, I think, in this summit where we can imagine what those tools might look like across many domains. But design tools which give credit for positive contributions to ecosystem service are really still quite underdeveloped.
One more thing, as we looked at the questions and thought about the work ahead, interoperability, once again, is key. Interoperability between the four domains that Carl has identified in the Venn diagram, but also between the tools that become developed, whether it's between 2D and 3D and 3D and 4D and hydrology and biodiversity, and all of this is the key to being able to make some joint progress rather than a whole bunch of individual spots on a map is going to be the ability to share data, to share results, to have a shared language, even an ontology perhaps, to enable the interoperability that's going to be essential to making the progress in making the kind of fundamental research on all the avenues that are going to be needed to move the geodesign enterprise along. So the community of researchers and practitioners, and whether you believe that practice is research or research drives practice or practice drives research or what the relationship of all of that is, it's got to be a community. No single individual contributions will be important, but one of the key problems and challenges for us is to grow this community in the way that we can really benefit and maximize and achieve economies of scale in this exercise. There are these various precedents. There are these competing frameworks and sets of ways of organizing ideas, and certainly in the few months that I've been thinking about it and with Mike's help and others, I'm not clear yet on where this goes. We don't have an agenda. Sorry for the false title. We have some thoughts about it, and perhaps a map of a kind of a universe of space that proves to be pretty interesting, I think, and may be a useful and informative way of locating our work. Where does public health fit into there that we've heard about? Where does economics fit? There are some very open questions still. And what set of terms might more productively and effectively organize all of the many ideas and concerns that we have is not yet fully clear to me, but I think we're certainly, I think, moving in the right direction. Want to say anything?
One more. So that brings up a process thing, since we're planners, which is that there are a couple of active groups that are starting to think about and discuss this. And one is the Spatial Decision Support Consortium that Knight Song Lee and now Tim Niergis, who are both here, have been active in organizing. So that's one opportunity to kind of collaboratively discuss this stuff beyond this conference.
Thanks to Tim, by the way, for bringing that about and offering to actually, in some ways, lead some thoughts on how to really productively use the SDSS structure and framework to help bring body and life to this enterprise.
And the second is we've established a Google Plus group, so anybody that wants to further this conversation can do it there. I use this.
Somewhat memorable
Yeah,
URL.
sorry. The Google Plus group's URL is even worse.
Yeah, they're tough.
I snipped it out there. Or you could tweet using #Geodesign Research as a hashtag, and that will help us to organize and find each other on this topic.
So we expect that this will be a returning topic over the next few summit meetings as we make progress here. We invite each and every of you to help think through, what do you wish we knew more about to get your work done and to achieve the goals of either implementing your favorite tool or addressing your favorite grand challenge, because both of those two things are important to what we do. Thanks very much.
Good job.